Hi, my name is Troy Baietto. I'm a solutions architect with A&M, and today we're going to be talking about data loss prevention, or DLP technology. With me is Robert Ochoa, our director of cybersecurity. I'm going to ask him a few questions, and we'll get some answers. The idea of data security and developing a DLP strategy can be daunting for most folks. So where's the best place for them to start?
Okay, Troy, that's a really great question. And often it's one that people struggle with, and that is absolutely overlooked. So I feel pretty strongly about before we can begin to create a DLP strategy, we have to take a step back and put a few things in place first. Primarily a framework to build your overarching security program. So that starts with a few things: policy, programs, and the associated controls. Think of those as nested objects. For example, you have a data management policy with a data loss program that supports it, and the associated controls, for example, like a cloud access security broker. So the policy, we should have a really good understanding of the policy. It should be something that's written, that's stated, that is easily referenced across the organization. And then the program implements the policy. It ensures that the policy is basically put into action. And one of the most exciting pieces of it, or where the rubber hits the road, is really the associated controls. And the controls enforce the policy and support the program by addressing the specific security requirements. For example, encryption or Apple's or cloud access security broker or any number of those things. So after your basic framework is put into place, there's an important part of the program and controls that's vital. And that is data classification to get to the meat and potatoes of what you're asking. Where do you start? Once your program's in place, you start with data classification. So data needs to be or should be classified, meaning ongoing and predetermined tags and metadata markers, for our tools to key in. So when your data is classified, your compensating controls can then key off that information and allow it or block it or decide what to do with it. I recently did an interview with Varonis that focused on classification, so we won't get too deep into that. But all this before you even get to enforcing your controls.
A great info. I think anybody who's been in IT for a little while, they can kind of understand that as time goes on, networks seem to be becoming more and more complex. So where do IT and security teams apply the DLP policies and controls within the enterprise?
Yeah, that's another good question, Troy. So there are so many places in the network that data can escape, that data can leak. And, we traditionally apply this around things like email and perimeter, but the scope of DLP just keeps growing, and our exposure and blast radius just keeps on growing. So there's a short list, and that's typically like your endpoint, your EDR, your email, inbound and outbound, especially outbound, but inbound and outbound. You have to look at the organization's data sets. So are they structured and unstructured? It's easy to, it's not easy. It could be challenging to do either structured or unstructured, but we do have to address both. And then there's applications. You have homegrown apps, you have COTS apps, you have your SaaS apps, and that is a really key place where DLP needs to be applied. Also, just I call it generic commerce, but the web. So where we're looking at transactions that happen over the web, interactions, feedback, that all has to be monitored for DLP. And then you have storage, including removable media. And so we can talk a little bit more about some of those compensating controls. But one of the other things that's often overlooked is identity and access management and your IDP or your identity provider. So that's another area to deploy DLP. And of course, we're only a few minutes in here and someone's saying AI, but generative AI. we have both private LLMs and public LLM services. And so we have to create the policy here that AI governs around that and then enforce it with DLP tools. So that's the highlights, Troy, of, what types of areas of the network, where you would apply those.
Great. Awesome, Robert. So we talked about how to get started, where to apply those controls, but there's so many security tools out there. What are the primary DLP tools people are gravitating towards?
Yeah, another really good question. And look, I am going to talk about this and address your question directly, but this is like a Ford and Chevy, Microsoft, Apple, Linux type of technology conversation. So generally speaking, people start with a cloud access security broker. So the markets, Gartner and Forrester, have several years ago sort of moved all of the DLP markets into security services edge. So I would say a cloud access, a CASB would be the first place to start. And the market leaders there are folks like Palo Alto, Cisco, Netscope, Zscaler, and the like. So those are all inside security services edge offerings from those partners, and they handle web, file sharing, applications, SaaS, the structured and unstructured data sets that we talked about. It's really in transit and at rest is where those tools focus. And then the lowest common denominator, and this continues to be the case across the cybersecurity stack, is endpoint. So EDR tools like CrowdStrike Falcon, Endpoint, SentinelOne, Singularity, Microsoft Defender for endpoints, and so forth. Your EDR will also handle the removable media controls, which is very important. One of the biggest ones, I say it's the biggest one because it's really the most common, is email. So you have things like encryption, business email compromise, or BEC. I mentioned before, not only outbound filtering and DLP controls, but inbound. Malware scanning, anti-phishing, and there's a whole set of inspection and policy enforcement that happens in email tools. Those common tools are typically things like Proofpoint, Abnormal, Cloudflare, Mimecast, Cisco, and then the entire Microsoft stack around the O365. When you get into the identity and access management and IDP realm, you're talking about things like, the Microsoft stack, so Entra ID, Okta. They have preventative safeguards for anti-phishing credentials. So there's the whole FIDO2 standard that, utilizes a variety of different credentials, from keys to cards to digital passkeys. But it's also the workflows for onboarding and offboarding employees. If you don't have an IDP or an IAM infrastructure that has preventative controls and that addresses the workflows, you are pretty susceptible to data loss. The workflows are very, very important there. And I think finally, I would say around generative AI deployments, again, both private LLMs and public LLM services, there's the governance piece. So, folks like Twilio, and then there's model routing, things that do interception, redaction, redirection, role-based access control. One of my favorite AI controls tool right now is SurePath AI. So yeah, there's a lot of things out there in the market. I just barely touched on a few, but hope that addresses the question, Troy.
Absolutely. There's certainly no shortage of work to be done on this topic. So thanks for the time today, Robert.
You bet. Thanks, Troy. Appreciate the time. Have a good day.
You too.